but basically a gift shop. Well, Mrs. Boswell was a divorced woman, like my mother. Mrs. Boswell had an only child, a boy, like my mother. The only difference was Mrs. Boswell had money and my mother didn't. The rent on that apartment was $55 a month, and it seems to me that the entire time that we lived there, we were between 3 and 4 months behind on the rent. My mother couldn't face Mrs. Boswell, so I was the one that had to go and face her and tell her that we didn't have the rent or give her a partial payment or whatever it might have been. And Mrs. Boswell would always lecture my mother to me and, send me home to pass along the information. Except during December. Mrs. Boswell would charge no rent during December. And Mrs. Boswell insisted that I do my shopping for my mother at her store. My mother had an uncle, a priest, Uncle John Welsh, who lived then in Manasquan, New Jersey. And every year he sent my mother $10 or $15. It varied year to year for a Christmas present, and it would arrive right after Thanksgiving. And every year my mother would give me whatever Uncle John had sent her for me to do Christmas shopping with. Well, I only bought for my mother. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, and by that time I had lost contact with my father. So every year I would go to Boswell's with my $10 or $15. And every year Mrs. Boswell would come over to me and she would slyly ask how much money I had. And I would tell her, I was just a child. And she would say, well, pick out something nice for your mother. And I would go around the store and pick out 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 items. Nothing, by the way, was ever marked in Boswell's. Or if it was, I never saw the price. And I would bring whatever I had selected up to the counter. And Mrs. Boswell would sit there with pen and paper and add up the price of the items that I had selected. And if I had $15, it seems that it would always come out to something like $14.83. And if I had $10, it would always come out to something like $9.37. It was always just enough money with a few pennies back in change, no matter what it was I selected. I'm sure there were years I selected things with a retail value of at least $100. What a lady. By the time I realized what it was that Mrs. Boswell had done, she had moved away and sold the store. I was never able to tell her. Another very special person was Mrs. Powell. Mrs. Powell was the mother of my best friend and heartthrob, Barbara Powell. Mrs. Powell was a widow with 3 daughters. Barbara was the youngest. Had a terrible crush on her, but she was also my best friend, damn it. And I spent a lot of time in my teenage years over at the Powells. Mrs. Powell worked as a waitress. And they were very poor people, too. They lived very frugally. But they were a great family. Tremendous love. It was one of those kinds of houses where all the kids gathered. After school, Saturday, Sunday, all summer long, every vacation. House was always filled with kids. I had a very special relationship with Mrs. Powell. She and I would sit and talk for hours. Christmas was a strange time at that house. At least I found it strange. You see, there would be no sign of Christmas. There would be no talk of Christmas at the Powell house until Christmas Eve. And what I'm about to tell you, I swear to you, is true, and I saw this for at least a half a dozen years. On Christmas Eve, all hell would break loose. On Christmas Eve, the Powells would buy their tree, decorate it, buy their presents, open them, and Christmas Day take the tree down. It was an extraordinary sight. But the intensity of the celebration for that one day was miraculous. I don't think I've ever known people who had more Christmas spirit. I don't think I've ever known people who enjoyed the holiday more. I've never known people like them before or since. There were some very special events around Christmas time. There was the year when I was in 6th grade and sang in the choir at St. John's Roman Catholic Church. Yes, indeed, I sang in the choir. The reason that year stands out is because I had a solo on Oh Holy Night. Oh, songs still bring shivers up and down my spine. I practiced for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. Christmas was always started off in the greater Philadelphia area with a Gimbals parade. Wasn't as lavish as the Gimbals, or I guess it's Macy's parade. Yeah, the Macy's parade in New York. But in Philadelphia it was Gimbals, and it was still a very big parade. And you either sat home and diligently watched it all afternoon on television, or you went over to Philadelphia and stood in the bitter cold and watched it. You had to watch the Gimbals parade. That was the official beginning of Christmas. And if I went back to the Philadelphia area, I would still spend all Thanksgiving Day watching it somehow. It was by far and away the best parade, with the exception of the parade that we had in Collingswood that usually came the day after Thanksgiving. Well, I suppose by today's standards it wasn't much of a parade. A couple of flatbed trucks with some decorations on them, all the fire engines in town, the high school band, a couple of civic organizations. But that was the official beginning in Collingswood of the Christmas season. That was the day they turned the lights on. Now, they had put the lights up weeks before, but they wouldn't turn them on until the official Collingswood Christmas parade. You wouldn't miss that either. And I suppose, again, if they're still doing it, if I went back to that area, I would be there on Friday night for the official beginning of Christmas in Collingswood, waiting with breathless anticipation for the lights to be turned on in the downtown business district, which was only three blocks long anyway. It was something else, too. The Bonsall School was right in the middle of the business district on Haddon Avenue. It isn't anymore. They've torn it down long since, but back then, it was still there. And every Christmas, they would set up Santa's workshop right out front of the Bonsall School. This is probably where some of the confusion about Santa Claus comes in, because every Christmas, George, the cop, would play Santa Claus. Now, we all knew it was George. We were positive of it. That didn't make any difference. I mean, even when you're 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, you still went to see George, and he gave you candy canes, and George didn't take too many chances, you see. For the smaller kids, when Santa would be talking to the smaller kids, George had a microphone and a public address system so that all up and down Haddon Avenue in Collingswood, the shoppers and pedestrians could hear the little kids asking Santa for whatever it is that they wanted. When the bigger kids came, George put the microphone down. He wasn't taking no chances, but nonetheless, he still gave you a candy cane and wished you a Merry Christmas, and we would stop by and see him 4 or 5 times a season. I wonder who plays Santa Claus now. There were some special gifts along the way. Strange thing is, the two that stand out the most in my memory were not of any great value. One I've talked about before. It was the share of Tasty Baking Company that my mother gave me when I was about, 25 years old or so. I still have it in a very, very special place. I long ago stopped sending in a change of address to the Tasty Baking Company for my 22 cents in dividends a year. It's a terrible thing to do. It messes up their bookkeeping, and I am very well aware of that. But, my God, it was costing me more to let these people know where to send the dividend than I was getting in the dividend. And doesn't really make any difference. The stock certificate is all that counts. I've always been a freak for tasty cakes. And then there was the last gift that my first wife ever gave me. We were already in the process of divorce, but nonetheless, she gave me a Christmas gift. And I don't really think